Hey there, this is Mr. Icarus, and welcome to yet another edition of Doom Mod Madness. This time round, we're checking out a total conversion mod by the name of Hedon. Don't worry if the name sounds familiar to you, I have in fact covered this mod before, but that was back in its demo form, over a year ago in fact, but now Hedon is available in version 1.0, meaning that it is playable from front to back, and that is exactly what I've done for the purposes of this video. I've given it a good, thorough playthrough. So what exactly is Hedon all about? Well, if you're after the Cliff Notes version, then this is a story all about how my orc got turned upside down, and I'd like to take a minute, just sit right there, and I'll tell you all about the time I became the bane of a cultist invasion. But on a more serious note, this is a pretty richly detailed total conversion that invents its own fantasy-styled world and populates it with a whole host of characters and races and creatures that have their own internal purpose, that have their own reason and logic for existing, and kind of tasks you with picking up the broken pieces after everything has gone wrong. You play as Hedon, a half-orc, half-demon, who wakes up with a nasty bump on her head in an abandoned mine. Everyone seems to be dead, and as you fight your way back to your hometown, you find that cultists, filthy goddamn cultists, have just made an absolute travesty of the place. But the real hook of the story, where the intrigue is generated, is through the fact that this invasion should not have been possible to begin with. This entire place is supposedly under the protection of, it's either a crystal ward or a magical ward, I can never remember which one it is, that prevent this kind of thing from happening. So automatically you're thinking, well, what could have gone wrong here? Is this the work of a traitor? Is this the work of some other nefarious force? Who knows? And that is what you are going to find out through the course of it. And to say any more than that would pretty much spoil how the story develops. But there is a lot of it. There is a lot of it. You'll be finding notes all over the goddamn shop filled with paragraphs upon paragraphs of detail. So if you're in that kind of mindset where you love delving into the lore and backstory of how a world operates, then you're going to find a lot to hold your interest within the world of Hedon. The average level here will also ask more of you than you may typically expect. Sure, the usual suspects are all present and accounted for, finding the requisite key for the appropriate door, flipping a few switches here and there, but sprinkled in amongst all that, you'll also need to acquire materials during the course of certain levels in order to create a tool that will allow you to progress forward, and the Forge here is a prime example of that. It's a level that will have you acquiring the raw materials from the mines below, bringing them up and smelting them into ingots before forming them into the requisite tool that you actually need. And while that description sounded quite simple, in practice it actually becomes quite a complex ordeal, especially when you sprinkle in the fact that you're going to have to hop, skip and jump your way around some rather deadly lava. But this is all ground that I've already covered from back when I experienced Hedon in demo form. As for the rest of the Hedon version 1.0 experience, I think it's safe to say that it's a bit of a chonker, both in terms of what you do within levels, the structure of the levels themselves, and the time it takes to complete said levels. If you're looking for a ballpark estimate, all I can tell you is that I don't think there's a single level here in Hedon that would take me less than half an hour to complete. In some cases, I was easily stretching over the 40 to 45 minute mark. And while it's nice to have levels that offer a lot of bang for your buck, it's crucial that all that time spent better be time spent well. It's in this regard that I feel Hedon occasionally stumbles. During the course of certain levels, I certainly got the sense that things would pace a little better if they were broken up into smaller, more digestible chunks. I got the sense that certain elements, such as finding key items or crafting ingredients, would flow better if they were slightly simplified. It's a classic problem, all things considered. The bigger a level gets, the harder it'll be to guide the player, to have them keep track of what they're up to at any given time. And there's certainly some concessions made in that regard. The auto map has a marker system that lets you plonk down numbers to vaguely remind you of what you were up to, and the in-game lore and the in-game text that you can read does offer some vital hints every now and again, but I do find it is a case of a little too much scattered, a little too far apart. That said, these frustrations do nothing to diminish the fact that these levels are quite the sight to behold in their own right. There's a real strong sense of visual design running through all of these environments, and a fair amount of variety too, even though I'm probably not doing it justice with the selection of visuals that I'm showing you here, but trust me, this mod goes places. If there's one aspect, however, that doesn't seem to quite mesh in terms of the visual design, however, it would be how certain enemies look against the backdrops themselves. For example, the Cerberuses, whatever the plural of Cerberus is. Brown on brown, sometimes hard to make out, and my other personal pet peeve would be cultists. Now, the cultists I can see, they're fine. You know, black against anything other than black is usually okay, but certain cultists throw spikes at you, and those spikes could probably be a bit more strongly defined, because unless they were stood in front of me and actually throwing it directly in my face, I couldn't tell you where that thing would actually be coming from, save for the sound effect. That's the one real saving grace for that, because you'll at least hear the whooshing as it goes past your head. On the subject of enemy-based irritations, good grief do I hate these little metallic assholes. These are called Forge Elementals. Actually, no, that's a lie. Forge Elementals are the big fat things that they spawn from. They're like a cross between a Cacodemon and a Pain Elemental, but covered in steel, and they belch lava. But anyway, Urchins are what these things are called, and they're like Lost Souls, but 100 times more irritating, because much like Lost Souls, they make a beeline for your face because they'd love nothing more than to headbutt you. The kicker being, when they do so, they explode. I think the thing that adds to the irritation factor most with regards to urchins is the fact that more often than not, they're actually used in ambush situations, and these situations usually arise at the least opportune moments, when you're already pretty low on the health spectrum, and all it takes is a little love tap from an urchin, and it's all the way back to your last save, which is gonna be far back if you're not on the ball, because, yeah, you're gonna be save scumming. Hedon will make you save scum. Enemies will regularly cluster or nail you from across vast spaces such as this one. It's already hard to see in this particular level, but if you've left one of these little spike-chucking cultists alive on a battlement across the way, they'll nail you. They'll nail you. And like I said earlier, you won't know it was them. You'll be like, where the fuck did that spike come from? I don't know, but it's embedded in my forehead. It's not a good look. So, I've just realized that I've gotten all this way through the video and I haven't really talked about the weapons yet. I should remedy that. And what better weapon to begin with than the heavy crossbow here, which as you can plainly see fires explosive tipped crossbow bolts. Its primary boasts a pretty generous splash damage radius, but the alt can be employed to reduce splash damage and increase pinpoint damage dealing. Useful if you've got a singular tough enemy to deal with, but as you can see in this situation, primary is all you need. There's also the canister launcher. Comes with two different flavors of canister, this being my favorite, a corrosive liquid that quite literally melts enemy faces. Also gets rid of shield-bearing enemies in double quick time, which is great for me because that's yet another enemy that irritates the ever-loving crap out of me. But the other canister spreads a sort of paralyzing mist, which has an interesting attribute in that it is flammable. But in order to trigger that, you'd have to switch over to something like the shotgun analog, which coincidentally has an alt fire that turns it into a flamethrower. The Lancer is an interesting weapon insofar as it's very much positioned as an endgame style weapon with a quite powerful primary fire that feels more akin to a plasma gun analog than anything else, and a secondary that essentially turns it into a BFG of sorts, that high damage dealing orb splintering into multiple smaller ones that careen all over the place. But that said, I can't help but feel that the Lancer is missing that very particular je ne sais quoi that comes from endgame weapons, that element of satisfaction, that feeling of power, if that makes any sense, especially when reeling off that secondary. Maybe it just needs a bigger boom. I'd be more than willing to pay the price. Alongside the weaponry, you've also got a host of support items to add a little spice in the midst of combat, such as haste, which will actually increase the fire rate of whatever weapon you're currently wielding. You've got stone skin, which will reduce the damage you take from hits. You've got an item that I'm pretty sure increases your attack power, and another item that will cause enemies to flee. Additionally, you can also employ the use of crystals that'll turn you invisible, allowing you to slip past enemies, or at the very least, turn them into tremendously lousy shots. In fact, I used an invisibility crystal to great effect earlier when facing down a bunch of urchins. For some reason, it rendered them incapable of landing an accurate headbutt on me. Last but certainly not least, you can also make use of a time stop crystal, which is a tremendously useful item. It's pretty much a trump card when you're dealing with a bit of an awkward situation or an awkward layout of enemies. Just pop that crystal, run around, whack your enemies in the face. They won't have time to react. By the time time flows back, they'll be in pieces. All in all, Hedon took me over 8 hours to complete, and that was broken up into 2 pretty significant play sessions. Would I recommend you do the same? Not really. If anything, I'd say take your time with Hedon, maybe even break it down to 1 or 2 levels per session, because if you play it in the big unbroken chunks like I did, you run the risk of turning minor irritations into full-blown frustrations. Really, Hedon is the kind of total conversion where it works best if you allow it to breathe, if you give yourself time to wallow in its levels and appreciate the smaller details, because there is a lot of detail crammed in here. It's quite astonishing, just the effort that's gone into bringing this fantasy world to life. That said, would I still consider my hang-ups with Hedon legitimate, considering the condensed fashion in which I played it? Absolutely. I still feel that some levels are overly long, just dragging beyond the point of enjoyment. The same thing goes for some of the sub-objectives that you need to complete in individual levels. They could easily be streamlined. And when it comes to the items that you need to acquire, in some cases, the placement could be made a hell of a lot more obvious. I know it's a little patronizing, but a big arrow pointing down to a key item can work wonders for visibility. And visibility can occasionally be an issue with certain very important parts of a level that are necessary to interact with in order to move forward. Believe it or not, Hedon does in fact feature several boss battles during the course of its campaign too, but you'll note that I've not really shown any footage of them, and that's largely because they tend to revolve around plot significant points, so I'd rather not spoil the fun. I'd rather you get to experience them for yourself. One of them, however, I do have to say takes the cake when it comes to pretty much being the definition of a bullet sponge boss battle. If anything, it feels like a battle that is emblematic of the hang-ups that I have with Hedon. It drags out for far too long, it starts to introduce extra elements that just don't really make it any more fun, just more of a pain in the ass to deal with, and by the time it's over and done with, you're kind of exhausted. And you know what, I actually feel kind of terrible for having to take a dump on certain aspects of Hedon, because none of what I've mentioned here makes this a bad total conversion. It is far, far from being bad, and the sheer effort and creativity that's gone into the genesis of this original work is astounding to me. It's practically its own fully fledged game. It's flawed, yes, but it's still fun. You know, this has been a tricky video for me, because ever since I played the first demo version of Hedon, I've been rooting for it. I've been very excited to see what the full version of it may hold for me, and even though this is version 1.0, you shouldn't take this as the final definitive statement on what Hedon is, because this is iterative. Version 1.0 does not mean the end, and I've heard it from the author themselves. There are tweaks still to be made, so who knows? A lot of the frustrations and irritations that I've experienced over the course of Hedon version 1.0 may just melt into irrelevance. One can certainly hope, and my frustrations may not be the same as yours. You may not even have the same ones. If you take my advice with pacing yourself through the playthrough of this particular mod, you may just wonder what the hell I was going on about in the first place. I certainly hope you at least give it a try, and in that regard, the link, as usual, is in the description below. While I'm at it, I'd like to give a great big thank you to my wonderful patrons over on Patreon. Thank you so very much for supporting the channel, and for helping to make content like this possible. If you're interested in lending a hand yourself, maybe you'd like to see your name in the credits, maybe you'd like to gain early access to my videos before everyone else, well, if that's the case, you'll find the link to my Patreon page also in the description below. Hopefully you've enjoyed this video. Feel free to let me know what you thought in the comments, and feel free to suggest any mod you'd like to see me cover in future editions of Doom Mod Madness. This has been Mr. Icarus. Thank you very much for watching. Icarus out.